Hi and welcome to this next video of the FAQ video series on the KNX IP BAOS 777. In this video we take a look at how the KNX IP BAOS gets its IP address. Now, in order to be able to access the web server of the KNX IP BAOS, it first of all has to get an IP address. Now, there are three options available. The first option is also the default option. After the startup of the BAOS, it will check the network if there is a DHCP server available. If this is the case, well then it will request an IP address from this DHCP server, which typically is your router. Now, in order for this option to work, there has to be a DHCP server available in the network the BAOS is connected to. If this isn't the case, well then you can also use the second option, the assignment via the EDS6. For this option, you can use the EDS6 and there under the device parameters you can set up the IP settings of the BAOS and then download it to the KNX IP BAOS. Now, there are also prerequisites for this option, because you need to be able to download those informations onto the BAOS, and therefore you must have an established connection between your EDS and the KNX network. And because the BAOS at that moment isn't parameterized with its IP settings, you can't use the IP interface of the BAOS. Therefore you must have, for example, a USB interface or a KNX IP router if you want to use this option. And then the third option, if you can't use a DHCP server and the assignment via the EDS6, you can always use the display of the BAOS to give it its IP address and the network configuration. And in this video, we now want to take a look at the second and third option. So I'm now in the EDS6 in a little example project that I have prepared. And in this example project, I have a twisted pair line with a KNX IP router 752 secure and a KNX IP BAOS 777. Now in this case, I don't use the KNX IP router for routing between twisted pair and IP, but instead I will use it as a programming interface. You can of course also use, for example, a USB interface instead. And now to set up the IP address of the BAOS, I simply click on the device, and here on the right hand side on the properties window, I will go to IP, and here I can set up the IP address. Now here I can either use the DHCP mode, which is the default case, or I can set it to a static IP address. Now here I will set up the IP address. I will also change the subnet mask accordingly, and the default gateway I leave here because I don't really need it in my network here. And now, after setting everything up here, I can simply download it onto the BAOS. Therefore, first of all, I check here that I have set up the connection. Now, as I said, you can also use a USB interface here, and I will use here my Ethernet connection, and I will download everything onto the BAOS. Now, as I download onto the BAOS for the first time, I also have to press the programming button. And after pressing it, you should see that the download has started. Now that the download has finished, we can check if the BAOS got its IP address. Therefore, we can first of all take a look at the display, and there we can see now that it has its physical address as well as its IP address. Another way to check if the BAOS has gotten its IP address is if we take a look here at the interfaces, we can see that now we can use the KNX IP interface of the BAOS, because now the BAOS has the correct IP address. Here we have it. And the last check that we can do is if the web server is available. Therefore, I go into my browser and type in the IP address of the BAOS. And as you can see, here we have the web interface. So this is how you can give the BAOS an IP address via the EDS6. Let us now see how we can give it an IP address via the display if, for example, we don't have an interface to our KNX network because we want to use the IP interface of the BAOS. Therefore, I will quickly reset the BAOS and the EDS6. Now I have resetted my KNX project as well as the BAOS itself. And you can see that I have deleted my IP router, so I no longer have an interface to my KNX network, which you can also see here on top. We only have the automatic mode, and the EDR6 didn't find any interface. And now in order to give the BAOS an IP address, I simply have to navigate within the display to ipconfig with the help of the buttons. And now here I will change from DHCP mode to manual mode, so to a static IP config. And now I can input the IP address and the IP settings that I need. Now after inputting my IP settings, I click on accept and then I close the window with the escape button. And on the start page we can see that the IP settings have changed and the BAOS now got its IP address. And now we can run the same checks as before. So therefore I go into the EDR6 and first of all check if I can now choose the BAOS as an IP interface. Therefore I click here on automatic, and as you can see here we have the BAOS 777 which we can use. Next up, I can also check again if I can reach the web server. So therefore I go back into my browser and type in the IP address, and as you can see we get the start page of the web server. Now we still need to download the physical address onto the BAOS because at the moment it only got its IP address. And before we can download that onto the BAOS, I first of all have to set up the IP settings within the EDR6, because otherwise we would override the settings that we just did with the default settings in the EDS. So therefore I go into the BAOS and under the IP properties I will change it from automatically, so DHCP mode, to the static mode. And again I will here quickly enter the IP address of the BAOS, changing the subnet mask accordingly to that, and the default gateway I don't need. And now I can download the physical address, so therefore first of all I choose the correct interface and then click on download. Now again I have to press the programming button in order that the download can start. Now that the download has finished, we can also take a look at the display, and there we see that the BAOS now also got its physical address. So that's that for this video. You now have seen the different options that are available of giving the BAOS its IP address.